Most people believe that a home is built of brick and mortar. They believe the heavy walls hold the roof up, protecting them from the elements. But they are wrong. The storm isn't outside, it is inside. I've spent my entire professional life dismantling the so-called perfect family, peeling back the layers of expensive wallpaper to find the rot underneath. And I can tell you this, a home isn't built on concrete. It is built on a series of silent, fragile agreements. Agreements to look the other way when the phone rings at midnight. Agreements to never ask about the locked drawers in the study or the missing money that vanishes from the joint account. Agreements to pretend that the stranger sitting across from you at dinner, the one pouring your wine with a steady hand, is still the same person you married 10 years ago. My name is Seraphina Thorne. I am not a counselor. I am a legacy architect. That is a polite way of saying I am the cleaner. I am hired to ensure that when a prestigious family falls apart, the neighbors never hear the glass shatter. Welcome back to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Today, we aren't looking at corporate giants or digital ghosts. We are walking into the most dangerous place on earth, the family dinner table. Because the person who loves you the most is the only one who knows exactly where to twist the knife. To understand the fall, you first have to understand the height from which they fell. If you drove through the winding, eucalyptus-lined streets of Silver Creek in the scorching, drought-ridden summer of 2025, you would eventually stop in front of the Sterling estate. It sat at the end of a long, heated driveway that melted the frost in winter and shimmered with heat haze in July. It wasn't just a house, it was a brutalist statement of intent. It was a monument to modern perfection, a sprawling structure of tempered glass and reinforced steel that seemed to hover, defying gravity, above the emerald-green manicured lawns that cost more to water than most people earned in a year. The Sterling family wasn't just wealthy, they were the apex predators of the social ecosystem. They were the envy of the entire Silicon Valley, the standard by which all other happiness, success, and stability was measured, and usually found wanting. Thomas and Elena Sterling were known affectionately by their friends and with venomous jealousy by their enemies as the Golden Couple. Thomas was more than just a successful residential architect. He was a visionary, a celebrity in his own right. He was the brilliant mind behind the city's new eco-skyline, a man who claimed he could turn concrete into poetry and steel into soul. He was tall, devastatingly charismatic, and possessed a lopsided, boyish smile that could disarm a hostile boardroom in seconds. He wore suits that cost $5,000 and wore them with the ease of pajamas. Elena was his perfect curated counterpart. As the beloved principal of St. Jude's, the district's most prestigious private high school, she was a pillar of the community. She was the woman who seemed to have a gentle solution for every child's academic struggle and a comforting, wise word for every parent's neurotic fear. They had two beautiful, bilingual daughters who played the cello at charity galas and won state science fairs. They had a lawn that never saw a brown blade of grass, maintained by a fleet of invisible gardeners. They had a life that looked like it had been curated, polished, and filtered for the cover of a high-end lifestyle magazine. But the cracks in the glass house didn't appear during a violent winter storm or an earthquake.
They appeared on a quiet, sunny, terrifyingly normal Tuesday afternoon. Elena called me. I remember the time exactly, 2:14 p.m. Her voice wasn't hysterical. It didn't tremble with the chaos of sudden discovery. It was worse. It was hollow. It was empty. It was the sound of a heavy church bell that had been struck one too many times and had finally, irrevocably cracked under the weight of its own resonance. "Seraphina," she whispered, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lung. "I found a key, a small, unassuming silver key taped under the bottom drawer of his mahogany nightstand. It opens a post office box in a town 2 hours away, a place he has no business being. And I found a second phone, a cheap burner phone, hidden in the torn lining of his squash bag. I don't want a private investigator who will take grainy pictures from the bushes. I don't want a marriage counselor who will talk to me about love languages and communication styles. I want you. I want you to tell me if our entire life is a lie before I decide whether to strike the match and burn it all down to the ground."
My investigation didn't begin in the dark alleys of the city or in the back room of a smoky bar. It began in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of Thomas Sterling's home office. The room smelled of expensive leather, old money, and the faint chemical scent of printer ink. I sat in his ergonomic chair, a $1,000 throne of mesh and chrome, and logged into the family's joint bank accounts using the passwords Elena had provided. To the untrained eye, the math was perfect. It was a symphony of fiscal responsibility. Thomas was a provider, a generous one. He paid the bills early. He tithed 10% to the local megachurch. He donated generously to the animal shelter and the library fund. His credit score was an immaculate 820. But I wasn't looking for generosity. I wasn't looking for perfection. I was looking for the bleed. Every lie has a cost, and somewhere in the ledgers, the truth always demands payment. When I started to cross-reference their home improvement expenses with the actual work done on their estate, comparing invoices to permits, dates to work logs, the numbers didn't just drip, they began to hemorrhage. For 3 years, Thomas had been invoicing structural repairs and preventative maintenance for a slate roof that never leaked and a reinforced basement that never saw a drop of water. The invoices were works of art in themselves, detailed, professional, printed on high-quality bond paper with watermarks. They listed labor costs, material fees, and contractor IDs, but they were completely fabricated. The contractor IDs led to dead phone lines. The addresses led to empty lots in industrial parks. The money, nearly $200,000 siphoned off in increments of $4,000 at a time, just under the radar of federal reporting limits, wasn't going to a licensed contractor. It wasn't going to a roofer or a plumber to fix a crack in the foundation. It was being funneled into a private, offshore trust registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell company called Origin. Elena sat across from me on a velvet settee, her hands trembling around a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She watched my face as I scrolled through the data. She assumed the worst, as wives often do when the silence stretches too long. She thought of a mistress, perhaps a young intern at his firm with bright eyes and no mortgage. She thought of a gambling addiction he might have picked up during his business trips to Las Vegas.
She thought of a second family hidden in another state, children who looked like her own but bore another woman's name. But as I traced the digital breadcrumbs, peeling back the layers of shell companies and encrypted transfers, I realized the truth was far stranger and far more pathetic. He wasn't spending the money on another woman. He wasn't spending it on a secret vice or a hidden addiction. He was spending it on something far more expensive and far more desperate, erasing his own origin. He was paying a specialized data scrubbing firm, a digital eraser, to delete his past. He was paying them to wipe his history from the public record, to scrub his name from old yearbooks and census data, to make sure that Thomas Sterling sprang fully formed from the head of Zeus, a self-made god with no parents, no hometown, and no history to drag him down.
The most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They are the ones we curate for ourselves, whispered so many times in the dark that they solidify into a kind of truth. Thomas Sterling's entire public persona, his very essence, was built on a single, tragic, and exquisitely compelling foundational myth. He was the self-made orphan. He told Elena on their third date over a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir in a restaurant with white tablecloths and hushed waiters that his parents had died in a horrific car crash on an icy highway in Montana when he was just 20 years old. He painted a masterpiece of tragedy with his words. He told her he had no siblings, no cousins, no aunts or uncles left to call on holidays. He was a singular entity, a survivor who had pulled himself up from the wreckage of his life by his bootstraps, driven by a lonely, desperate need to succeed because he had no safety net to catch him if he fell. This story was not just a story, it was a strategy. It won Elena's heart. It explained his emotional distance, which she mistook for profound grief. It explained his obsession with building perfect family homes, which she saw as a noble quest to create the stability he never had. It made him a tragic hero in his own narrative, a man to be pitied and admired in equal measure. But my job is to burn down the myths. I began my search in the digital archives, a graveyard of forgotten facts and buried truths. As I dug into the national death indexes, the Social Security database, and cross-referenced his supposed history against vital records in 3 different states, I found what I call the void, the empty space where a truth should be. The crash he so vividly described, it never happened. There was no icy highway in Montana with a wreck matching those details. There were no obituaries for a John and Mary Sterling on that date. There was no police report. Thomas didn't have dead parents. He had a living, breathing family in a small, dusty, forgotten town 3 states over, a place called Oak Haven, where the main industry was rust and the primary export was young people leaving as fast as they could. I found them through a reverse search of a high school yearbook photo from 1998. He had a mother, a retired waitress named Martha Miller, who lived in a single-wide trailer with a perpetually leaky roof and a collection of ceramic cats. He had a father who had worked at the local lumber mill until his back gave out and his pension disappeared. And he had a younger sister, Sarah Miller, whom he had abandoned 15 years ago without so much as a goodbye note. He hadn't just moved away to chase a dream. He had orchestrated a complete erasure of his identity. He had legally changed his name from Tommy Miller to Thomas Sterling. He had paid for speech therapy to surgically remove his rural accent. He had capped his teeth and bought a new wardrobe that cost more than his father's yearly income.
He had vanished into the ether, leaving his family to face foreclosure on their small farm alone. He let them lose the land that had been in their family for 3 generations because he didn't want the burden of their poverty to stain his new elite life. He didn't want his Silicon Valley society friends to know he came from dirt and gravel roads. He didn't want Elena, his perfect, polished Elena, to meet a mother who smoked cheap cigarettes and wore polyester pantsuits. He had traded his blood for a cleaner brand. He had orphaned himself, not out of tragedy, but out of vanity and shame.
The post office box Elena found, tucked away in the back of a dingy postal annex in a forgotten strip mall between a laundromat and a vape shop, wasn't for love letters from a secret mistress. It was for something far colder, more brutal, and more transactional. It was the delivery point for hush money. Thomas's sister, Sarah Miller, the ghost he had tried to erase, the loose thread he thought he had snipped 15 years ago, had found him. Her discovery wasn't a miracle of fate or a stroke of private investigator brilliance. It was the inevitable, soulless outcome of the digital age. A facial recognition algorithm scraping data from a local newspaper article about the golden couple and their recent philanthropic work had flagged his face. A match, a ghost in the machine, a past he couldn't outrun. I sat in a rented sedan with tinted windows across from that sad little post office, the engine off, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt. I watched the handoff. The scene wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a movie scene with dramatic music and whispered threats under the cover of darkness. It was something far more pathetic and depressing. It was just 2 estranged siblings standing in the pouring rain under the flickering, sickly green neon sign of a liquor store. He, in his expensive, water-resistant trench coat, looking at her with a raw, undisguised contempt. She, in her worn-out jacket, looking at him with a mixture of cold pity and weary disgust. He passed her a thick, unmarked manila envelope, and she passed him a month of silence. The betrayal wasn't just a personal wound inflicted upon Elena. It was a systemic, ongoing betrayal of his own identity, a monthly ransom paid to keep his past buried and his perfect present from shattering into a million pieces. I drove back from my surveillance through the snarling afternoon traffic, the squeak of the windshield wipers counting out the monotonous, hypnotic rhythm of deceit, deceit, deceit. The rain had started again, a miserable gray drizzle that blurred the world outside into a watercolor of smudged pastels. I returned to the Sterling's glass house, a place that felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit on the perfect life. I found Elena in her cathedral-sized kitchen, a room so white and sterile it felt like an operating theater. The air smelled of disinfectant and faint, expensive perfume. She was making school lunches for her daughters, an act so mundane, so beautifully, heartbreakingly normal, it felt like a desperate rebellion against the chaos that was about to consume her. The movements were mechanical, robotic, precise, as if she were diffusing a bomb. She was carefully slicing the crusts off of thick-cut, artisanal white bread, arranging the pieces on a marble countertop, as if this one small act of maternal care could hold the collapsing universe together. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, were fixed on the task, but she wasn't seeing the sandwiches.
She was staring into the abyss, her mind clearly miles away in a land of dread and suspicion. I watched her for a moment, my own reflection a ghostly figure in the polished chrome of the refrigerator. In my line of work, this is the hardest part, the delivery, the moment you hand someone the poison and watch them drink it. I didn't tell her about the offshore accounts first. I didn't mention the shell company named Origin, a name so cruelly ironic it had to be intentional. I didn't show her the forged invoices for the roof that never leaked. Numbers are cold, abstract. They are sterile wounds. They don't bleed. I needed to make it real for her. I started with the one thing that would cut through the financial jargon and hit her directly in the heart. I sat down at the cold marble island across from her. "Elena," I said softly, my voice seeming to crack the sterile silence. "I found his family." She stopped mid-sandwich, her hand frozen in the act of spreading a thin layer of grape jelly. The silver knife hovered in the air, a single perfect drop of purple hanging from the tip like a tear made of sugar. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. Her reaction was far more terrifying. A scream would have been a release, tears would have been a surrender. Instead, a chilling stillness came over her, a preternatural calm that was more frightening than any outburst. Her gaze lifted from the sandwich and drifted out the expansive, floor-to-ceiling kitchen window to her two daughters playing on the expensive swing set in the perfectly manicured backyard. Their laughter, a sound from another, more innocent world, was faintly audible through the thick, soundproof glass. It was as if she was looking at a photograph of a life that was no longer hers. "He told me he had no one," she whispered, and the words were so quiet I had to lean in, the sound barely audible over the low, constant hum of the sub-zero refrigerator. "When we first met, he told me I was his only world, his only family." Her eyes glazed over, lost in a memory. "He let me cry with him on the anniversary of a funeral that never happened. For 12 years, every May 14th, I have held him while he grieved for parents who were still alive and well in a trailer park. I made his mother's favorite dinner, a recipe he invented. I bought him a new black tie. He used my empathy, my love as a tool. He used his grief as a shield. He used it to get me to forgive him for his late nights at the office, for his emotional distance, for all the times he seemed a million miles away. He didn't just tell a lie, he weaponized it, and I comforted him for it. I defended him to my parents when they said he was too reserved, too closed off. I told them he was a man who had lost everything and was still standing. I was so proud of him, so proud of his strength. What a fool I was. I wasn't married to a strong man. I was married to a ghost."
Elena didn't confront him that night. The hollowed-out, grieving wife I had spoken to in the kitchen was gone, replaced by something colder, harder, and far more focused. She decided to play the game, a skill she had learned and perfected over years of brutal school board politics and PTA meetings with vicious, smiling mothers. She didn't throw his custom-made suits on the perfectly manicured lawn. She didn't scream or throw a wine glass at his head. Instead, she did something far more terrifying. She threw him a party. She invited Thomas's most important business partners over for a celebratory dinner.
He had just landed a massive city-defining contract to design the new public library, a legacy project. It was a night of fine wine that cost $1,000 a bottle, imported cheese that smelled like old socks, and forced, echoing laughter that bounced uncomfortably off the high, minimalist ceilings of their cavernous living room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet desperation. The table was set with a dozen place settings, each one a tiny battlefield of polished silver and starched linen. I was there, of course. My official role was to help the caterers, a silent, uniformed observer in the background, refilling glasses and clearing plates. It gave me the perfect vantage point. From the kitchen, I watched the golden couple through the swinging doorway. It was a masterclass in performance art. Thomas, at the head of the long mahogany table, was a king on his throne. He was holding court, charming the guests, a venture capitalist with predatory eyes, a city councilman with a weak chin, and their respective bored wives who were more interested in the size of the diamond on Elena's finger than anything their husbands had to say. He regaled them with his practiced stories of his lonely childhood and how the tragedy that shaped him taught him the value of a solid, trustworthy foundation in buildings and in life. He was magnetic. He was brilliant. He was a complete and utter fraud. He spoke of his orphan's grit with a catch in his voice that was so perfectly rehearsed it could have won him an Oscar. And every time he mentioned the word foundation, I saw Elena's hand tighten around the delicate stem of her crystal wineglass until her knuckles turned bone white. I was half convinced the glass would shatter in her hand, showering the table in a spray of blood and burgundy. She smiled, a perfect, polite, chillingly vacant smile. She nodded along, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears that could easily be mistaken for adoration. She even reached out and touched his hand at one point, a gesture of wifely support that was so cold it could have caused frostbite. She played the part of the adoring, supportive wife flawlessly. But her eyes told a different story. They were cold. They were calculating. They were the eyes of a predator that had finally cornered its prey and was enjoying the last few moments of the hunt. She wasn't a wife anymore. She wasn't even a woman scorned. She was an auditor, watching a failing business pitch its final, desperate, fraudulent numbers before the inevitable, glorious, and very public collapse.
The front door clicked shut, the sound of the heavy deadbolt locking echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, oppressive silence of the house. The last of the guests were gone, their fake laughter and expensive cologne finally fading into the night. The performance was over. Elena didn't go to bed. She didn't start clearing the plates, a task the caterers would handle anyway. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace over to the long mahogany dining table, now a desolate wasteland of half-empty wine glasses, crumpled linen napkins, and the ghosts of conversations. She held the small silver key to the P.O. box between her thumb and forefinger and laid it on the polished wood surface right next to Thomas's half-full glass of Merlot. It sat there, small and insignificant, yet heavier than an anchor, a tiny metallic bomb in the center of their perfect life.
Thomas was humming to himself, a tuneless, self-satisfied melody. He was loosening his silk tie, a man basking in the afterglow of a successful evening, convinced he had once again charmed the world. "That went well, don't you think?" he said, his back to her as he poured himself another glass of wine. "I think we really sealed the deal with the library tonight." He was oblivious, a captain celebrating on the deck of a sinking ship. Elena didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her voice, when it came, was calm, measured, and terrifyingly soft, a blade of ice in the warm, quiet room. She simply asked, "How is your sister Sarah doing, Thomas? Is she still living in that run-down apartment you're paying for with our roofing money?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to collapse the lungs. I watched from the doorway as the color drained from Thomas's face. The charming, confident mask he had worn all night didn't just slip, it cracked and shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered little boy underneath. He turned, his hand shaking so violently that red wine sloshed over the rim of the glass and onto the white carpet. He simply sat down heavily in his chair at the head of the table, his entire body seeming to deflate, his face aging 10 years in 10 seconds. He didn't deny it. He didn't make an excuse. His first instinct wasn't remorse. It was damage control. He looked past his wife, his desperate eyes searching the shadows of the room until they found me standing by the kitchen door. He asked me, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper, "How much does Seraphina want to make this go away?" He still didn't get it. Even then, at the end of all things, he thought I was just another line item on his secret ledger, another problem that could be solved with a discreet wire transfer. He thought his wife of 12 years, the mother of his children, was a disgruntled shareholder who could be bought off with a bigger dividend, a fancier car, or another diamond bracelet from Tiffany's. He didn't understand that this wasn't a negotiation, it wasn't a business deal, it was a liquidation, and I was just there to audit the ruins. "It's not about the money, Thomas," Elena said softly, her voice echoing in the large, empty-feeling room, a stark contrast to the boisterous laughter that had filled it just an hour before. "You think you can buy your way out of this? You think a check can fix this? I've been sleeping next to a ghost for 12 years. I don't know who you are. I've shared a bed with a stranger, raised children with a fiction. You didn't just lie about your parents, you lied about your soul." Thomas, desperate now, his face pale and slick with sweat, turned to me, his eyes wide with a pleading, childish terror. "Seraphina, talk to her, make her understand," he stammered, gesturing wildly as if physically trying to hold his collapsing world together. "This is a complication. It's a business decision I made a long time ago. Men of my status, we have arrangements, skeletons in the closet. It's normal." He wanted me to intervene, to mediate, to normalize his deceit, to frame it as a necessary evil on the path to greatness. He wanted me to be his co-conspirator, another paid employee on the payroll of his lies. But my job isn't to protect the liar, it's to architect the fallout. It is to ensure the demolition is clean and absolute. I stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway, my heels clicking softly on the cold marble floor. I was holding a thin manila file. It didn't contain the financial records. Those were for the lawyers. This was for him. "This isn't about business, Thomas," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the countertop. I opened the file and spread the contents on the mahogany table next to the damning P.O. box key. They weren't spreadsheets. They were copies of overdue medical bills from the state-run nursing home, the paper cheap and stained with coffee rings. They were unpaid ambulance fees. They were rejected insurance claims for experimental treatments that might have eased her pain, each one stamped with a brutal, bureaucratic red, "Denied." The bills he could have paid with a single month of his office expenses slush fund. The treatments he could have afforded with the money he spent on a single case of wine for tonight's dinner party. I pointed to a specific document, a letter from a hospice nurse written in neat looping cursive. I read it aloud. "Mrs. Miller has been asking for her son, Tommy. She's lucid for a few hours a day. She thinks he's just lost. She told me to tell him that she's not mad. She just wants to see his face one more time." I slid the letter across the table. "She asked for you, Thomas, every day for the last 2 weeks of her life. He had the money to save her. He had the money to give her a comfortable, dignified end, to hold her hand as she passed, but he chose to let her die, alone and in pain, surrounded by strangers, so she wouldn't embarrass his aesthetic, so her poverty wouldn't tarnish his brand. He had signed her death warrant with his silence, and now, finally, the invoice had come due." Thomas looked at the letter, his breath catching in a sob, the carefully constructed mask of the golden couple architect finally crumbling to dust, revealing the hollow man beneath.
The nature of the betrayal shifted then. The quiet, intimate horror of the kitchen confrontation was over. This was a declaration of war. Thomas, his face ashen, looked up from his mother's hospice records and saw not his loving wife, but a formidable, cold-eyed adversary. He realized that Elena hadn't just hired me to find the truth. She had hired me to build a weapon. He saw the name of her brother, a notoriously ruthless, high-stakes divorce attorney from a top-tier San Francisco firm known for his scorched earth tactics, on the retainer agreement I had placed on the table. The golden couple was being liquidated, not with a quiet settlement, but with a very public, very brutal execution. And Elena wasn't filing for a standard no-fault divorce. That would have been too kind, too quiet. She was suing for a public annulment on the grounds of fraud, a legal maneuver designed not just to separate, but to obliterate. She wanted to erase his name from her life, from her children's lives, with the same cold legal precision with which he had erased his own family from his. She wanted to make him a non-person, a ghost in his own history, a man who never was. Thomas's carefully built world, his glass house of lies, began to implode in real time, the shockwaves radiating outwards. The business partners he had so masterfully charmed that night, the venture capitalist with the predatory eyes called him at 6 a.m., his voice dripping with icy rage. He had seen the morning news. The city councilman, the one with the weak chin, texted him a single panicked message: "We're ruined." I had already anonymously leaked a detailed dossier to a hungry young reporter at the city's largest newspaper, the kind of journalist who lived for scandals like this. It contained copies of the blackmail payments, Sarah's desperate pleading emails, and his mother's death certificate, time-stamped just 3 weeks after he had closed on their multi-million-dollar mansion.
By morning, the story was on the front page, the headline a brutal all-caps declaration: "Architect of Lies, City's golden boy built empire on foundation of deceit." In the modern world of ethical architecture and corporate social responsibility, a man who abandons his dying mother to protect his brand is a liability that no firm can afford. His legacy contract for the new city library was officially under review, a polite corporate euphemism for dead on arrival. The foundation of his entire career, built on the carefully constructed lie of the orphan's grit, was crumbling into dust, and the wolves were circling.
The karma that found Thomas Sterling wasn't a dramatic court date with flashing cameras or a cold jail cell with iron bars. It was something far quieter, more elegant, and infinitely more profound. It was the sudden, absolute, crushing silence of the house he had built. By the end of the week, the movers, a silent, efficient crew that Elena had hired, had come and gone. The house was a hollow shell, an echo chamber of his failures, where every footstep sounded like an accusation. Elena had taken the girls, of course, their laughter and light spirited away in the back of her black SUV. But she had also taken every piece of furniture she had ever picked out, every painting she had ever hung, every rug she had ever laid. The walls were scarred with the pale ghosts of picture frames. The floors bore the indentations of furniture that was no longer there. She left him only two things: the long mahogany dining table, a stark, lonely monument to their last supper, and the small silver key to the P.O. box that had unlocked his ruin. Thomas now sat on the floor in the center of the vast empty living room, surrounded by the invisible architecture of his downfall. The smart home security sensors he had paid a fortune for to keep his secrets safe were still working perfectly. The irony was a bitter pill that caught in his throat. The motion detectors kept the lights bright and clinical, following him as he wandered from empty room to empty room. The climate control kept the air crisp and cold, chilling him to the bone. The security system, with its network of cameras and alarms, was still armed against intruders. He was perfectly, utterly protected in a house that contained absolutely nothing and no one of value. The home he had built to impress the world was now just an empty, sterile box, a mausoleum for a life that had never really been alive. He had finally achieved the clean start he had always wanted, the life free of any messy connections to a past he was ashamed of. He was officially and completely alone. My work was almost done. The contracts were signed, the accounts were settled, the dust was beginning to settle. But there was one final loose thread, one final piece of the architecture that needed to be put into place. It wasn't for Elena, it was for me. I made one last call. I found the number for Sarah, the sister, the ghost who had inadvertently started this whole avalanche with a facial recognition hit. I told her that the monthly payments were stopping permanently because the trust that funded them had been dissolved. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, the sound of a woman processing the end of her strange, bitter livelihood. But before she could respond, I gave her the address to the glass mansion in Silver Creek. I told her her brother was there, alone. I didn't know if she would come. I didn't know if she wanted revenge or closure, but I knew she deserved the choice.
I was there, of course, a silent observer in the shadows of the grand, echoing hallway when she finally arrived. She came in a beat-up pickup truck that looked like it had been through a war, a stark contrast to the Teslas and Porsches that usually lined the driveway. She didn't come to yell or to demand more money. She looked tired, worn, her face a roadmap of a hard life, but her eyes were resolute. She walked into the vast, empty living room, her worn-out sneakers silent on the expensive, polished hardwood floors. She looked at her brother, a man she hadn't spoken to in 15 years, a stranger with a familiar face, sitting on the floor of his hollow empire, surrounded by nothing but the echoes of the life he had lost. And she handed him a small, battered, wallet-sized photograph of their mother, the corners soft and frayed from years of being held in a calloused hand. "She waited for you every day, Tommy," she said, her voice devoid of anger, replaced only by a cold, devastating pity that was far more damning. "Every time a car came down the road, she'd look up, thinking it was you. She thought you were just lost. She thought one day you'd find your way home. She'd be so sad to see that you actually found exactly what you were looking for all along. You're a self-made man now. You made yourself an orphan. You made yourself a ghost." And so the glass house shattered. The dust has settled, leaving behind the wreckage of a life built on lies. As we end this account, I want you to do something for me. Look at the golden couples in your own life. Look at the families that seem too perfect, too curated, too flawless for this messy, imperfect world. The ones with the perfect Christmas cards that arrive on time every year. The ones with the high-achieving children who play varsity sports and get into Ivy League schools. Look at their perfect smiles and their perfect homes, and then ask yourself, what is buried under the expensive, imported floorboards of that beautiful house? What silent, unspoken agreements hold up the roof? What truths are being ignored in the name of peace? We all have a past we aren't proud of. We all have corners of our history we'd rather keep in the dark, dusty and forgotten. But there is a difference between privacy and a lie. There is a difference between a past and a performance. When you try to build a future by paving over the people who loved you first, when you treat your own history like a liability to be managed, the cracks will always, always find a way to the surface. Trust is a fragile architecture. It is built slowly over years of honesty and shared vulnerability. And once the foundation is revealed to be a lie, the whole house, no matter how beautiful, no matter how expensive, is just a pile of expensive wood and glass waiting to collapse. This is Seraphina Thorne. I leave you with this question to debate in the comments below. Is it possible to truly love someone if you don't know where they came from? Is a marriage built on a carefully constructed narrative a marriage at all? Or is every relationship just a performance until the lights go out and we are left alone with the truth? Subscribe to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal, because the most expensive thing you will ever buy is a life that isn't yours.